you not think that there is a very serious problem that will arise from the kind of future that you have sketched there, and which undoubtedly exists, and the imbalance that must necessarily exist, therefore, in staff training, and the balance that you give to staff training at the very high end of the technical spectrum, and all that means for the prosecution of war, but the ability of officers to continue to prosecute the battle even when all their systems are very seriously degraded? And are there not very serious implications for future training on that account? And is it not also the case that with our friends and allies in the Gulf, that is going to necessitate even closer joint military training, so that we all understand exactly where we are?
Well, I think there's a great deal in what you say, and we have started a joint staff approach now, because we believe that this whole business of jointness needs to be understood by staff officers. But we are absolutely determined that before they can become joint staff officers, they must understand how their own service works, otherwise they won't be very good joint staff officers. And now our new course is split between single service work and joint work. But we also have to train our officers much more in the technical staff work if they are to get the maximum benefit out of the technology we give them. And currently, every staff officer has to do a 6-month staff course before he begins his main single service and joint staff training. There are, of course, people in defence who go into procurement areas or the equipment areas, and they have to do very much more than that. It's early days, but I think we're moving in the right direction, but I don't underestimate the difficulties.
Does that answer your question?
Well, up to a point.
Which you think you would like to go on?
No, I do think that there are the balance of training, as you say, between the technical and the training that goes into staff officers training to prepare him for warfare. I once saw at the JRDF headquarters a map which showed so much information that no commander could possibly have wanted, and how to handle that information so that you keep to the core issues of your task seems to me to be a very difficult thing.
Well, I think the intelligence side is particularly difficult, because nowadays there's so many ways you can get intelligence, and even in a command post at a fairly junior level, you are subjected to information from satellites, from patrols, from aircraft, from sensors, and you can easily be swamped, and the gold in the intelligence picture is often submerged in the dross which surrounds it. I think there is artificial intelligence which helps. I personally think there will always be need for highly skilled, trained intelligence staff officers who have to interpret what they find. I think it's extremely important, really, to keep information away from commanders which we don't need. If you ask a commander what he needs, he invariably says he needs everything. And we have to be very disciplined in what is available.
Mr. Tanner.
The Chief of Defence Staff touched on a point which strikes me as particularly important, and which I wonder if I could ask him to expand on a little. It was this question of the delivery of weapons of mass destruction, and the risk that you specified that there was a probability that they could be more likely delivered by special forces or terrorist groups. And taking the latter risk, it seems to me that up until now, terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction has not been a factor, partly because of the difficulty of obtaining and building these weapons, partly because I think in some cases there have been constraints on their use. For example, I think the IRA would not have used WMD terrorism, because it would probably have harmed its cause more than benefited it. I wonder if we're not now moving into a position where those constraints are less valid. I mean, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with proliferation, it's more easy for terrorist groups to obtain such weapons. And constraints that might have applied would apply perhaps less with groups such as the jihad group of Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman. I wonder therefore whether you could say, Sir Charles, whether you see this as now a real threat, and if so, how you would imagine Western states and the Gulf states, who are equally vulnerable, might deal with it.
Well, I think it is more likely to happen. I hope it won't happen, but if you look to see what happened on the Japanese subway 2 or 3 years ago, that was a fairly fanatical group which got their hands and knew how to make a very dangerous weapon. They were prepared to use it. Now, are other groups around the world, obviously not just in the Gulf region, who really, I think, would use it? Not many of them, but there are groups who would take the risk, and they wouldn't actually worry very much about what other people thought and who they damaged, maybe innocent third parties. That wouldn't really, there are not many. I did say that I thought what is very important for us, one of the most important things, to have intelligence on these groups. There wasn't much intelligence about the Japanese group. We have to work at that. And of course it is very attractive to people who haven't got very much money to get their biological weapons. As I said, there are many scientists who can do this very easily. There are some weapons which you can learn how to make if you look at the internet. So there is a problem. And delivery means are very expensive. And often not very efficient.
Just a couple of comments. First, I think the biotechnology area is one that requires increasing attention just simply because something that size can be pretty devastating if distributed effectively. Its problems of distribution are quite different from sticking things on the top of missiles when you're talking about something so small. We have assumed, and I think this is relevant to the point about the IRA, that a group that has political objectives has to weigh the methods they use against those political objectives. And I suppose that will continue to be the case. Where I think one is in difficulty is with 3 different sorts of group. First, those with very weird political objectives that they don't necessarily share with anybody, and that was evident in the attack on the World Trade Center. And American militias and so on. Secondly, groups with no political objectives whatsoever, as the Japanese sect, came into this category, and people now are calling pre-millenarian tension, seems to produce a number of these groups that have a particular dramatic vision of the future of the world and their role in it. And lastly, simple extortionists, organised crime. And I would have thought this is one area where we're going to have to pay more and more attention to. And that is one of the consequences of the breakup of the former Soviet Union, of groups that have the resources and money and possible access to technology to put some rather hideous demands to us.
I wonder if I might direct my question to Charles Guthrie, and it's this, he'll remember, as many of us here do, that it's become part of the folklore of the Gulf War that a number of armoured divisions in Germany had to be cannibalised in order to put one effective division in the field. Whether that's entirely accurate or not, it's certainly what many people believe. And when he was making a contrast between static situations and more mobile situations, it occurred to me that in a static situation you can probably afford a bit of what's sometimes called window dressing. But if we are serious about moving to much more mobile forces, making ourselves available, for example, to go to the assistance of the countries represented here, does not that pose a real obligation to ensure that all units are fully manned, that all equipment is properly maintained, and put it not very elegantly, that if we claim to have the capability of an armoured division, it's got to be a real armoured division?
Well, that is absolutely right. In the days of the Cold War, we had the luxury of a fairly long warning period, and the things we could put right in that time, I can't remember what it was, I think it was 2 years, something like that.
We vary between 2 days and 2 days.
But it was a long time, and we felt that we could put things right in time. We also did have a tank which was quite old and was unreliable. And one of the things we've done about our new tanks is to make quite sure that they are the most reliable tanks in the world. And we're making every effort to man them properly. But you're absolutely right. Today, we are, sad to say, that we are on the border of Kuwait in a couple of hours. I exaggerate a bit, but the Russians could not attack us in a couple of days. So we need to have forces in a very high state of readiness, which are properly trained and properly manned. I think is more important than ever. The other point I'd make is we went back, and Peter and I were in Germany together. There were really 2 reasons why we had to catalyse our tanks. One was that they were old, and we hadn't got the spare parts. We would have had them in time, I think, if the Russians had come. But also, there was still some threat from the Russians in those days. So we had to leave some people in Germany behind, including him and me.
Just respond to that, just as well as Mr. Gorbachev, who was
Yes.
Politburo and after the Brexit.
Yes. I mean, he still had a war machine, which could have been switched on very much more quickly than it could be today.
I mean, the basic problem, I mean, I think if we put the tank to one side, it was actually remarkable what we got to the Gulf and the speed with which we got it there, bearing in mind we went with minimum post-nation support. I mean, tremendous help, but they were not expecting us to deploy that. But the basic problem was the tank, that it was compounded also because it was going to operate in an area that tank was never designed to operate in. So the engines, instead of lasting, I forget now, I think we were to about 5,000 kilometres per engine, were probably doing about 2,000 kilometres per engine. So inevitably we had to strip out many more engines to cope with that particular problem, and the war maintenance reserve became more difficult. But the basic question, and the answer you've given is right, and the main lesson from it is you want equipment that is reliable. And that's why now such emphasis is being given to producing a reliable tank. But one doesn't want to get all the other bits of kit that went there and operated extremely effectively.
Thank you very much. Richard Cobble. Both speakers mentioned high technology systems and the fact that the United States is galloping ahead with the capability of these systems faster in general than anybody else because they're putting more effort into research. And there is, of course, the problem that was also mentioned of interoperability between the would-be allies of the United States and the United States itself. And the key to this interoperability, again, as mentioned, is the command and information systems. Again, Chief Defence Staff mentioned that the United States had an interest in preserving allies who could operate with it. But we recently have had a seminar here looking at the interoperability questions of command and information systems. And the United States speakers, both in industry and not far from the Pentagon, said that there actually was no great problem with interoperability of command and information systems, just that other nations should buy American. And that other methods of achieving interoperability weren't very easy to see how they would work. Clearly, in the United Kingdom, we have a little difficulty with that. At the conference, there was certainly, at the seminar, there was difficulty from European nations. I imagine there would be difficulty from other nations who would like to cooperate with the United States. Is there a better way?
Well, I think if we have to fight alongside the United States, we do need to make some investment to ensure that we can do that. That does not mean to say that we have to spend as much money on command and control systems and technology as the Americans do. We have to work out what we really do need, and we have to make it quite clear to Americans that if they want us alongside them, they must understand what we can afford and what we can't, maybe lower their prices as a result.
Charles, could you answer the same question in relation to our colleagues in the Gulf? Sorry, Michael Alexander. I was going to ask exactly the same question, Richard, but in specific relation to collaboration in the Gulf itself with the armed forces there. What are the implications for their procurement policies, and is our ability to collaborate in the Gulf with Gulf forces increasing or diminishing at the moment?
I would say it is increasing. But what we have to do is to make quite sure that the kind of equipment we buy are interoperable. They needn't necessarily the same equipment, but they do have to have a linkage and a way of working together. It's a very difficult question, because I think that where I say that I think it's getting better in some areas and not in others. And in some areas, particularly with the United States, they are going very far ahead.
I am studying Kuwait and Boston Tigers. So I have one short comment to make and a very short question after that. The short comment, we agree with you about biological and chemical warfare. We believe it is the poor man's atomic bomb, since much cheaper to acquire and way easier to prepare. We believe a student, second school, now second year medical school, with available in the market, could develop a chemical weapon and deliver it in the back of the truck. That's my comment. My question is, you mentioned that UK forces concentrating on interoperability, and because so far we either training or working with NATO forces, or forces using NATO equipment, but automatically are interoperable with them because of their standards. It's also true the same for us, because mostly we are NATO standard forces, and thus our hardware a little bit interoperable. However, my question is, how do you interoperate regarding military doctrine and regarding rules of engagement? Thank you, sir.
Well, military doctrine is something which we've taken very much more seriously of late in this country and have set up, particularly organisations, and it's going to actually feature, I hope, very much in the defence review to develop this. You can't actually develop it in isolation. You do need to develop it with other countries. We have tended to develop it very much with the Americans and the Europeans in the past. But I would think that in the future, as far as the Gulf is concerned, it will be very important for us to go forward and understand each other's doctrine and try and harmonise them as much as we possibly can. And history is absolutely littered with examples when allies have gone to war with different doctrines, and I think it has been a real disaster. So I would look forward to working very much closer in the doctrine field and exchanging talks. I think we were lucky, actually, that a lot of our tactics, our concepts and doctrine had actually been forged with the Americans and with our European allies in NATO, mostly in Germany. And therefore, when we were able to send a British division in an American corps in the Gulf War, it actually worked remarkably smoothly. But if we hadn't worked together, we didn't understand each other, that would have been very difficult. We would have found it extremely difficult to work as closely with the French as we would have with the Americans. But the French were not actually working closely with us in Germany and in NATO. What did you say? You had a second part.
Interoperability and the rules of engagement.
The rules of engagement are an absolute nightmare. And the British, who I think are probably as legally minded as any nation, find arriving at rules of engagement extremely difficult. And when General Colin Powell retired, his farewell speech, he said, "There's one thing I shan't miss when I go to retirement, and that is another British legal position." But we do take it very seriously. And I think one of the reasons we do is because of our experience in peacekeeping and such operations. They call up Northern Ireland peacekeeping. We have to be, we're very conscious of the pitfalls about civil law and military law. And we have some soldiers, even today, who are in prison in Northern Ireland because we didn't obey the rules of engagement. But it is extraordinarily difficult to arrive at common rules of engagement quickly. And I think this is another area, rather like doctrine. The more talk you can do amongst yourselves before the conflict, the better. But even if you talk, the lawyers are absolutely infuriating at the last moment. I can give you many examples. But lawyers are, bad like vegetables.
On that note, trying to sum up, because there's been a lot of very important points that have come up in what has been a comparatively short session on this very important subject. If I could just try and pick out one or two, I think, key points, particularly as they affect the very important relationship between the United Kingdom and the GCC. And to start with, if I could reinforce the importance, which I think rightly the Chief of the Defence Staff attached to retaining a high-intensity conflict capability. Once you lose that capability, it takes years and years to get back. In fact, once lost, maybe it simply may not be possible to get it back. But at the same time, he rightly reminded us of the very wide spectrum of conflict that armed forces could face in the future. And that produces a real challenge. And directly related to that high-intensity capability is, of course, what has been called the revolution in military affairs, rather well put, I thought, by Professor Laurie Friedman when he said it's a very good marketing term. But there is new technology out there. Deciding which are the right priorities is going to be, I think, a very important challenge for all of us. But a key one to me is looking at the command and control side, because if we can't work together effectively, because we haven't got the right command and control that works together, it doesn't matter how good the fighting power of the units is if we can't coordinate it properly. So that, I think, will be a real challenge. Intelligence was raised on a number of occasions. I think, of course, the need for intelligence has not only become greater, but we've also got the problem of overload, and we still have the basic problem of we can assess someone's capability very easily, but there's still a long gap between assessing the difference between capability and the intention to use that capability. And getting that right, and being careful we don't spend too much time talking about, if you like, technical and strategic intelligence, and forgetting the critical importance of human intelligence, I think actually is very important. And my sense is that the human intelligence side doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. But it is a critically important point. In talking about multinational forces, first of all, I again strongly endorse what has been said about the importance of alliances or people who might work together in war, coming together in peacetime, and not just for sort of exercises between two frigates or two battalions, actually exercising both government, ministers, officials, and also exercising what I think that the army would call formation level. Because unless you do that, you won't really be able to come together at short notice for war. I think that's enormously important. I think it's a very important point. And I do sense it's an area where we can all work together and we certainly can all improve it. And I think the two final points I would touch on, Laurie Friedman rightly made a very important point, the fact that the information war, if you like, is here to stay. But I thought he made a very important point when he said what is critical in handling that is that the civil societies from which those armed forces are coming, if you like, feel not only secure within that society, but feel they have the support of that society. And Charles Guthrie and I have a practical, I think, example of that. We went to visit the forces preparing for the Gulf War 2 days before the air war started. We knew the date that the air war was going to start. The army was then deployed into the desert. They knew they were about to go to war. They didn't know exactly when it was. And now General Denaro, then Colonel Denaro commanding his regiment, but his regiment and all others, I think we were very struck by the number of soldiers, officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers who asked us and wanted to be really convinced that their nation was behind them. And I think that's an enormously important part. It gives them an enormous confidence. And when people talk about casualties and things like that, if people really believe that what their armed forces are doing is right, then I believe some of those problems don't become quite the problems we tend to make.